Hey everybody, in this demonstration I want to show how to do a simple 3D logo extrusion and also a few tricks and techniques like adding some reflections, adding some lighting, and how to do a nice camera orbit. So you can see here in this example I'm using the Nike logo here. So I'll start by making a new project. Whoops, new project. There we go. And I'm going to import the assets that I've got. Now I've got a Adobe Illustrator file here, and to do a logo extrusion, you need the file to be either Adobe Illustrator or generic EPS, so one of those vector formats. So I'm going to bring that in, and I can just bring it in as single footage because it's only one layer. And then I've also got a background picture here that I'm going to use. So I'm going to pull that in as well. And I'll make a new composition. I'm going to call this logo extrusion. And using my 720 HD settings, 15 seconds, I'll hit OK. All right, so I'll start by adding the logo to the composition. And now this is a black logo, a black background, so you can't see it. I'll hit the checkerboard background button there so you can see the logo. So to turn a vector file into an extruded 3D object, you first have to convert it into an After Effects shape layer, because unless we're using an outside program like Cinema 4D or using a plugin like Element 3D, to turn something into a 3D object directly in After Effects, it's either got to be a text layer or a shape layer. So we select the layer, we go to layer, we go to our transform group, or excuse me, not transform, we go to our create group, and we choose create shapes from vector layer. That is the important step right there. That converts the Illustrator or EPS file into an After Effects shape layer, so it can now be extruded into a 3D object. Now, at this point, I can delete the Illustrator file. I don't really need it in here anymore. And before I turn it into a 3D layer and start doing stuff with it, though, what I recommend you do is open up your shape layer, open up your contents group, and go through all the groups that you see here, because basically all the paths that were in that Illustrator file are converted into After Effects, shape groups. And there may be stuff you don't need, especially if you're using a logo type that, might have been prepared for print instead of, prepared specifically for 3D work. So you may need to go through here and delete groups that you don't need. You can turn the visibility switch on and off. You can also name these groups if you hit return on your keyboard. So like, I'm going to just quickly go through here and, any of the ones I don't need, like I don't need that one, I'm going to hit delete. I don't need that one, I'm going to hit delete. I don't need that one, I'll get rid of it. And the ones that I'll keep, I'll rename so that I know what each group is. Okay. So it's definitely worth taking a moment to do that, to organize your file before turning it into 3D. And, if there's a large number of groups, that can make things tricky too as far as turning it 3D. So it's a good idea to clean things up. So now I'm going to turn the logo into a 3D extruded object. And to do that, we click our 3D switch here in the timeline to enable 3D for the layer. And then we need to change our 3D render engine. Instead of the classic 3D, which limits us to just flat two-dimensional planes in 3D space, we need to choose either the advanced 3D or Cinema 4D render engine. So I'm going to choose the Cinema 4D one, which is a little quicker on an older machine. The advanced 3D one has a little bit higher video card requirements, I believe, because it automatically adds shading. So if you want to automatically add shading, You can choose that one if you've got a machine with a good enough video card. Otherwise, stick with the Cinema 4D one, and then you'll just have to add virtual lighting to get your shading, which is what I'll be doing here. So I'm going to go with the Cinema 4D one. And now to look at this from an angle, I'm going to go to my 3D View pop-up menu, and I'm going to change it to Custom View so I can see this at an angle. And now down here in the timeline, I go to the geometry options, which are now available. Opening that up and going to extrusion depth and then cranking up the extrusion depth. And this is how we can add some volumetric, 3D depth to our layer. So again, this is something we can only do with shape layers or text layers in After Effects. And I'm going to go ahead and grab my camera tools. Up here we have the orbit tool, we have the pan tool, and the dolly tool. When we're in a custom view, we can use these tools to change our angle of view if we need to, so we can look at this from any angle that we want without actually having to rotate or move the layer. And in this case, you can see that's adding some nice extrusion depth, but because it's a black logo and I haven't added any lighting or anything, the extrusion's not really paying off. So in fact, the next thing I want to do is show you how to change the colors on the object. So if we go back here to the shape contents, and we want to be able to add front colors, bevel colors, side colors, and back colors to our object. And to do that, though, to have it affect all the parts of our object, what we first need to do is create an empty group. And then we put the objects inside the group like that. So everything is nested in one group. Then we can go to the add menu and we can add front color, different colors within that parent group here. So it'll affect everything that's nested inside of there. So you can see here adding a front color, that gives me a color value for just the front of the object. So I'm going to choose maybe a kind of a medium gray color here. And then I want to add a bevel color. Now I haven't added a bevel to the object yet, so I'll come back to that. Down here in the geometry options where it says bevel style, I'll choose one of the bevel options. There you go. You can see it's adding a bevel around the edge. Let me zoom in here so you can see it better. And I want to make that bevel a solid white color so it gives it a nice edge highlight. And then I'm also going to add a side color. And again, I'm going to pick a kind of grayish color, maybe a little bit of a darker gray this time. And then if I wanted to add a back color, I could do that too. And I'm just going to sample the same color I used for the front. There we go. So now I've got different colors targeted to the different sides of the object. So I'll go ahead and close that group. Let me zoom back out here. And so that's basically how you can set up a 3D extruded logo by, taking your Illustrator file or your EPS file, converting it to a shape layer, and then cleaning up the contents, turning 3D, using Cinema 4D or Advanced 3D Renderer, and then using the geometry options to extrude and bevel your object. Now, the next thing I'm going to do here is create a simple animation of the logo. Now, animating this layer is just like animating any layer. You can use your transform properties to animate the layer. So, for example, if I wanted it to, fly in from off the side of the screen, I could keyframe position, maybe come back here to the beginning, and then I'm just going to drag the Z position value, holding the shift key to move it in way big increments so it moves off into the distance. Now keep in mind, I'm in the custom view here. I'm not in the render view. The render view is the active camera or front view by default. So that's the view that will be rendered if I don't add a camera layer. But you can see that by animating the position of the layer, we can animate it just like any other kind of layer. So I'm going to animate the Z position to kind of bring it in here a little bit. Now I would like the, once the logo kind of zooms in here, I would like to have my view kind of orbit around the logo. Now I could animate the layer's orientation or rotation property, but I want to show you a cool trick here for doing a nice camera orbit. And to do that, all we need to do is make a camera layer. So if we go Layer, New Camera, make a 2-node camera. So we have a point of interest and a position for the camera. So 2 position values for the camera, 2-node camera. And of course, whoops, let me double check my lens preset here. I want to use a 50, maybe I'll go wider angle. Let's go 15 millimeter. Wow, super zoomed in there. Let me bring the logo back on the Z-axis. There we go. I had it too far forward. Now, I'm looking through the camera right now, but if I go back to the custom view and zoom out, you can see, here's the camera. There's the logo that I've animated zooming in toward the camera, okay? Now, as I was saying here, the camera has 2 position values. It has a point of interest. That's where it's pointing, okay? And then it has the camera location. Now, what I want to do is have the camera orbit around my logo. And instead of trying to struggle with animating the position manually, here's the trick that I wanted to show. If I add a null object, if I go Layer, New, Null Object, and add a null object to the scene, click the 3D switch, and then link the camera to the null object like that. Now all I have to do is rotate the null object using either the Y rotation or the Y orientation value, doesn't matter which. And you can see that makes the camera orbit perfectly without having to animate the camera position. See, that makes the camera orbit around the logo in the center of the scene perfectly. So let me switch back to the camera view, see what the camera's seeing here. Zoom back in a bit. And when I scrub that null object Y position, you can see this nice camera orbit. Now I'm using super wide angle lens right now. If I want to change that, I can double click the camera layer, go back to my lens preset. Maybe I go 24 millimeter and then bring the the logo a little further back. If I want to keep it centered in the space, I would just zero the Z position for the logo. And then when I rotate the null here, there we go, you can see. All right, so I have it come zooming in. I think I want it to come zooming in from the side, so I'm going to rotate my camera a little bit like that. I'm going to keyframe the Y position, or excuse me, Y rotation. And then as the logo is zooming in, I'm going to have it rotate around. So maybe I go a few seconds forward, and then I'm going to have it rotate around to this side, maybe like that. All right, let me set my work area, load a preview, and see how it looks. So that's going to come zooming in. Here, let's turn off the checkerboard background for a minute. And then the camera orbits around. Now it seems like it actually is coming a little too far forward. I think there may be a Bezier curve handle on this path here. Oh yes, because look, I accidentally have set 2 position keyframes. That's what's the problem. I've got an extra keyframe there I don't need. Let me delete that and take another look. So yeah, keep in mind that when you change the position value, if you're at a new point in time, a keyframe is automatically going to be set. All right, pretty cool. So in fact, I think I have this keyframe maybe over here a little bit. There we go. All right, pretty cool. So the next thing I'm going to do here is add some lighting And then I'm going to add my background picture and enable some reflections in the object here. So to add some lighting, I'll go to Layer, New, Light. And I'm just going to add a simple point light with the intensity at about 80. And I don't need cast shadows for this example. I'll hit OK. Now that starts to add some nice shading here. I'm going to go to the top view, and you can see where the light is located. Here, let's turn the checkerboard on for a minute so you can see the object. And what I want to do is set up the lighting. I'm going to put one light here at the front corner. I'm going to duplicate it and then drag the other one over here to this side. I'm going to duplicate it again. I'm going to have one over here in this side, duplicating it one last time, and I'm going to have one over here on this side. So I'm basically lighting it from all four corners. Now let's take a look from the camera view again. There we go. You can see we're now starting to get some nice shading on here from the lighting. Now here's the thing. When this animates back though, see, it goes through the lights. It's going to overexpose. It's going to, bloom out like that because the lights are not moving with it. So here's a tip. If I take the light layers and I parent them to the logo, when the logo animates back in Z-space, see, the lights go with it. So that solves that problem of the object moving through the light and overexposing. Get the light rig that I've made to stay with the logo. All right, that looks pretty cool. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my background picture. And I'm going to duplicate it because I want to have one copy that I'm going to use as what's called an environment layer. So by selecting this layer and choosing Layer and then Environment Layer, what happens is that layer basically becomes an environment that can be reflected in our object. So think about it like it's being mapped to the inside of a sphere that encompasses our scene. So you no longer actually see that layer. See, if I turn off the original picture at the bottom here, this layer, the one that's now an environment layer, which has this little sphere icon, is no longer visible because it's now mapped to the inside of an invisible sphere. So we actually, I don't know if we need to have that eyeball on or off there, but the point I'm getting at here is if we go to our object, and if we open up our object and go to the material options, which the material options properties are all of the properties that affect how a 3D layer interacts with lighting and reflections in a scene. So shadows, lighting, and reflections. These are all of your settings about that stuff. So there, there's some cast shadow and accept lights, appears in reflections. These are all just on-off switches. Then you've got some properties here, ambient diffuse, specular, and metal. These are all how the layer reflects back different kinds of lighting in the scene. So for example here, if I wanted my specular highlights from my, point lights to maybe be brighter or more defined, I could play around with these specular settings to try and work with those. Okay, or overall light reflectivity, I could play with the diffuse or ambient values. Okay, so you just have to experiment there. And then the last three that you see are the reflection ones. So reflection intensity, if that's at 0, then there's no reflections. But if you crank that up, you're going to see whatever layer or layers are specified as environment layers are now going to be reflected in the surface. Okay, if it's at 100, then it's at the full, strength. So you can, of course, play with that value. And then there's sharpness and roll-off values to experiment with if you want to kind of blur the reflection a little bit. Now here's a couple more tips that actually just came up here. One thing you may notice with your reflections, because like I said, the environment layer is being mapped to the inside of a sphere and then reflected onto this object here, you may see seam lines. See, like right here in my example, I've got a seam line where the image is wrapping back around on itself, and that doesn't look good. So if I go to the environment layer, you'll see that it really only has a few properties, including orientation and rotation. So this is how you can make adjustments if there's, a seam line in a place where you don't want it to be. You can rotate the sphere that the environment is being reflected in to correct for that. Okay, so that's one tip right there, using the rotation or orientation for the environment layer. And then another thing I wanted to touch on real quick here is with the lighting. See, I've got 4 lights that I created. If I go back to the top view or the custom view for a minute and zoom out, you can see it. There we go. There's my model in the middle. There's my 4 lights. I would like to be able to maybe rotate my light group without having to move them all individually. So here's another tip. If I make another null object in the center of the scene, and I'm going to call this light ROT for rotation, I'm going to link the light layers to that layer, making sure the 3D switch is on. But then I'm going to link that layer to the model, because again, I want the lights to stay with the model when it animates into the scene, right? But now that I've got this null object here as a kind of intermediate layer, I can use that layer's rotation to rotate my light rig around my model. So now I'll go back to the camera view here, zoom in a bit, take a look. And so to better light my object, oops, there we go. To better light my object, see, I can adjust that rotation to control where the lights are in relation to my model. All right, hopefully this is giving you some ideas for working with these lights, creating rigs by linking things to null objects. So this one here, actually I should rename that, call that one my camera orbit, because that's what that one's controlling. And then just to kind of wrap up this demo here, I'm going to take the image that is my background here, and I think that it's a little too distracting. I'm going to add an effect to it. I'm going to throw a lens blur on there, camera lens blur, and I'm just going to crank up the blur radius to throw it out of focus so it becomes more of just kind of a background pattern or whatever. And I think what I'm going to do is put a white solid layer underneath it. Just give myself a solid color card here to drop in there and put underneath it. Oh, let me make sure it's the composition size. I forgot to hit the comp size button. There we go. And then I'm going to drop the opacity on this image layer down just to kind of wash things out a bit. So again, this is really just creating sort of a slightly stylized background here. There we go. All right, that looks pretty cool. Now, of course, I could continue to develop this, adding additional effects, maybe to the logo, or playing with the lighting some more. But like I said, hopefully this gives you some ideas for how to get started doing some simple 3D logo animations directly inside of After Effects using Illustrator or EPS formatted files, and then adding lights and camera as well as reflections to the object. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.